Hello, welcome, and thank you for taking the time to download this podcast show from Talk, Mind and Heart. My name is Kevin O'Doherty. I'm a psychologist, I'm an author, and a cognitive behaviour therapist. All of our shows will focus on personal, mental, and spiritual development. Many of the shows that I personally deliver will be on psychological health and well-being from a CBT perspective. My partner Teresa Khan, NLP life coach, Reiki master, teacher and author, will be interviewing a variety of teachers, therapists and inspirational speakers over the coming weeks and months. We really want these shows to be as inspiring, informative and relevant as possible to our listeners and subscribers. So please do share with us your thoughts, feelings and questions. We love to hear from you. Our training and consultancy website is www.calibergold.com and you can get in touch with us from there. On that website there's also a lot of links to the private practice website of both myself, Kevin O'Doherty, and Teresa Khan, in case you want to get in touch with us about anything to do with these podcasts or to discuss therapeutic issues. Finally, to ensure that you don't miss out on any of our shows, please do subscribe. We're really keen to share this service with as many people as possible. And please do spread the word. In today's programme then, this is CBT for Anxiety number 2. We'll be looking at thinking errors and anxiety. We'll be looking at the cognitive aspects of anxiety. The central idea of CBT is that our thoughts play a large part in our feelings. So if we're feeling depressed, for example, we might have depressing thoughts, focusing on the negatives, for example. If we feel anxious, the idea is that there are some anxiety-provoking thoughts going through our mind at times when we feel anxious. So the central, or one of the central ideas of cognitive behaviour therapy then, is that link between what we think and how we feel. To illustrate anxiety-provoking thoughts then, let's just start with a fictitious example. Let's imagine a lady's in bed asleep at night time. She hears a loud bang downstairs. She's in the house by herself as far as she knows. So she hears a bang downstairs in the middle of the night. She might think to herself, oh, it's that cat again. He's come in through the cat flap. He's knocked something over. He's a silly cat. And if she interprets it in that kind of way, she might kind of laugh to herself and turn over and go back to sleep. If she thinks to herself, oh, I imagine that's my husband again. He's home late yet again. She might feel angry if she interprets it in that kind of a way. She might interpret it in a very different kind of way, and she might hear the bang and say to herself, oh, it must be a burglar, it's an intruder, somebody's obviously gotten into the house. He or she might come upstairs and find me here, they might have a gun, they might shoot me, I could end up dead. Okay? Very different interpretations there from different perspectives. The same thing happened. There's a bang downstairs and the lady doesn't know what caused that bang. So we've looked at different possible interpretations, different possible thoughts that might go through the lady's mind, and each one of those interpretations would have a very different consequence in terms of how she feels. Now remember, she's upstairs in the bedroom and she doesn't know what caused that bang downstairs, so she doesn't have any direct evidence. So her interpretation of what caused the bang are assumptions. Okay, so the idea then in terms of CBT and anxiety is that the way we interpret situations, the way we think about situations has very real consequences for us. Okay. Remember, I think I've said in a previous podcast There is no right or wrong way to think. So we're not saying that in CBT, not at all. But there are helpful and unhelpful ways to think about stuff. There are constructive and not so constructive ways of thinking about things. Okay. When we feel anxious, very often we're perceiving some kind of a threat or danger. So we might think to ourselves, gosh, I'm going to be made redundant. What if I lose my house next year? What if I can't keep up the payments on my car? What if my wife leaves me next year? What if I contract a physical illness of some kind or a disease? What then? Okay. So when we feel anxious, there's some kind of a thought going on, a thought process that interprets some kind of a danger or threat to us. Okay. Okay. Let's have a look at another example. Let's imagine George gets an email from his boss asking for a meeting in the afternoon. So the boss has asked George to go and meet him in the afternoon. Okay. Now let's imagine that George interprets this in a very anxiety-provoking kind of a way. So George might think to himself, oh, what's this meeting about? I must be in some kind of trouble. Maybe I'm going to be fired. Maybe I'll be made redundant. Maybe my boss is going to give me lots and lots of things to do that I won't be able to manage very well. Okay. Now, as a result of those kind of thoughts going through the mind of George, he's very likely to feel anxious and worried about that meeting in the afternoon. Okay. So you can see there that one of the things that George has done is he's made negative predictions about that meeting. He's assuming that it's something negative or threatening or bad is going to happen, and that's why the boss has asked to see him. So he's making negative predictions. He's also doing a certain amount of mind reading there. So he's trying to imagine what the boss is thinking by asking for the meeting. Okay. So two of the so-called thinking errors there are evident. Negative predictions about the future and mind reading. Okay. Now, George doesn't know yet the reason for the meeting. It could be to give him a promotion. It could be to inform him that he's going to have a raise. It could be just to congratulate him on some very good work that he's been doing just lately. It could be to tell him some news about what's going on in the company and how the company is going to be developing and changing over the year ahead, and how the boss would like George to play a very important part in that. We don't know yet, and George doesn't know until he has the meeting. But those negative predictions are going to ensure that George feels a certain amount of anxiety about that meeting. Okay? Okay, I think it would be helpful for yourself listening to this podcast, perhaps to do a brief exercise where you look at a recent example of where you've felt some anxiety, perhaps today or in the past few days or in the past week. Have a think about a very recent example of where you felt anxious. Okay, and if you're lucky enough not to have felt any anxiety just recently, I'll tell you what to do shortly so that you can keep track of a situation that happens in the future, perhaps in the week or the weeks ahead, where you feel some anxiety. Okay. Now, at each stage of this task, I'd recommend that you pause the podcast, make the notes and draw the table that I'm going to explain in a moment, and then press play again for the podcast. So pause it as and when you feel you need to. Okay. So I'd like you to take a sheet of paper and draw two vertical lines down the sheet of paper so that you end up with 3 equal-sized columns. Okay. So again, pause this podcast whenever you need to. So you've drawn 2 lines down the page to make yourself 3 equal-sized columns. Now in the left-hand column, I'd like you to give it a title and put the capital A in the left-hand column. And the title is Activating Event. In brackets, what happened? Okay. Pause the podcast now whilst you do that. Now in the middle column, I'd like you to put a capital B and the title Thoughts and Beliefs, in brackets, about what happened. Pause the podcast now whilst you do that. And in the C column, the third column, put the capital C and the title Consequences, in brackets, how you felt, stroke emotions. Okay, now pause the podcast as and when. Have a think about a recent example where you felt anxious. Perhaps your boss asked to see you during the week, or perhaps you had a red letter from the bank or from somebody, or there was a knock at your door at 11:30 at night. So something that happened where you felt some anxiety. Okay, write down what happened in the left-hand column, in the A, the activating event column. Pause the podcast whilst you do that. Now, in the C column, that's the third column, write down how you felt. So write down anxious, worried, upset, distressed, stressed, butterflies in the stomach, sweaty palms, etc., etc. Okay? Write down exactly how you felt at that time during that incident that you're writing about. Pause the podcast now whilst you do that. Now, finally, in the central column, the B column, with the title Beliefs and Thoughts about what happened, write down what thoughts went through your mind when you felt that way. So when you felt the anxiety, the worry, the stress, write down the thoughts that were going through your mind just before that or during that period. Okay? Okay, pause the podcast whilst you do that. Okay, welcome back again. Now, that exercise there is very common in the early stages of CBT. We call it the ABC model, and it's basically a model to help people to get to understand the links between what they think and how they feel. And it's an exercise to help people to look at a recent example of where they felt anxious, worried, depressed, etc., etc. Okay. So once you've completed all 3 columns of that exercise, I'd like you to draw an arrow from the B column over to the C column. Now the idea here is, it's a central idea of CBT, and the idea is that it's not what happens to us that causes the distress or the anxiety in this case, but rather it's what we think about what happens to us that causes the distress. Okay, so it's not the knock on the door at 11 o'clock at night that causes the distress, but it's our interpretation of that knock at the door that causes the distress. Okay, so if we think to ourselves, 11 o'clock at night, it must be the police, maybe there's been an accident, maybe there's some kind of trouble, maybe it's a burglar at the door, etc., etc. Those kind of interpretations naturally will create anxious feelings. Okay. Now, once you've completed that exercise sheet, the ABC sheet, have a close look at it, and you might want to pause this podcast several times and come back to it at a later time. But have a good look at each one of those columns. Okay, look